today, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Kevin Bales. Kevin is professor of contemporary slavery studies at the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation, WISE, at the University of Hull in England. Dr. Bales is the author of several books on modern slavery, one of which, Blood and Earth, he'll be speaking about today. But not only being a scholar and an academic, Dr. Bales is also very active in the policy world. He was one of the co-founders of a non-for-profit organization called Free the Slaves, which is still quite active today. It's based in Washington, D.C., and which has done some very meaningful work in helping liberate people enslaved today and helping them reclaim their lives with dignity and purpose. So I think we're in for a treat. Let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Bales.
Thank you, Monty. Didn't you think it was a little weird the way the word old kept being projected on his forehead? You didn't see that, but... And do you think that had anything to do with him just getting tenure? Right? It's like he got tenure and it's like, old Monty. Anyway, it's great to be back. You know, I've been here at Richmond several times. Monty and I do a number of projects together and publish together, so we're often hanging around together. And the reason I'm talking about this new book in particular is because it's just been published. It's about 2 weeks hot off the press. I've been on a book tour for the last 2 weeks, crisscrossing up and down and back and forth across the country. So I actually came here from a blizzard in Minnesota after arriving there from a heat wave in Orlando, Florida, and I don't know quite which climate I'm living in at any point. So I want to talk to you about that book, but it's also about releasing, in many ways, new information that's come out in the book, because a lot of the things that I've written about in this book, even though it's about 7 years in the making, this book, 7 years of research behind this, we didn't release the information until the book was published, because there are some new things. So you're hearing things that most people haven't heard anywhere. So the first thing I want to do, though, is a couple of things that are not in the book. I want to just put out some basic information, two little short things about basic information about slavery today. One, just so if you're not familiar with the realities of contemporary slavery. The first is to let you know that by a very conservative estimate, and it's an estimate that Monty and I both have worked hard on in a very large project called the Global Slavery Index, we believe there's something like 36 million people in the world in slavery. And that's important to know because it's going to come up later in terms of how we figure some things out. This map shows you where those slaves are, not in terms of their raw numbers, but in terms of the proportion of the national population which is in slavery. So this is it's not about just the raw numbers. It's about, so if you look at the country of Mauritania, which as you probably know is right up there, the sort of darkest red one in northwest Africa, that's the country that we believe has the highest proportion of its population in slavery. About 4% of the people in Mauritania who live in Mauritania are enslaved. That's not a huge number because Mauritania, in spite of being an incredibly big in area, has just a few million people who live there. Likewise, if you can see that little dot there in the Caribbean, that little dark dot, that's Haiti. And Haiti, again, a small place, but we think the population of Haiti is about 2% enslaved people, primarily enslaved children in what's called the Restavek system. And we're confident of those numbers in both of those places because for Haiti, we've now had the 2 random sample representative surveys, valid surveys, that help us to understand the distribution of children in slavery there. And likewise, we've actually been able in our joint work to commission a world poll, a Gallup world poll in Mauritania, where we also got counts of how many people we think are. The country that we think has the most people in slavery is in fact India, something like 14 million people out of the 1 billion people that live there. But you can see that density. And the other key basic point that I want to tell you about slavery is notice there are no blank spots on this map, right? Of all the 168 countries that we cover in the index, there are no countries that have no slavery. We think there are a few countries, really tiny little island countries like Vanuatu, places like that out in the South Pacific that may not have any slavery. But otherwise, every place we look, we find people in slavery. Point one. Second foundational point. You may be saying, wait, how is this guy defining slavery? Right? You know, if slavery isn't it not supposed to exist anymore, it's not legal anymore. What is this, you know, are we really talking about slavery? And the answer is yes. The slavery today is identical in many, many ways to the slavery of the past, including the slavery of the distant past, all the way back to not just the Middle Ages, but ancient Greece and Rome and so forth. Now it's true, it's not legal today, but you should also know that slavery existed before the invention of law. Before there was ever written law, there was slavery. We know that from ancient history. We know it existed before the invention of money, so it's pre-monetary. And we know that at different times in different places it's been illegal or illegal or just condoned or whatever. The way we understand and define slavery is that it's a situation where one person is completely controlled by another person. They treat that person as if they are property, and that means that they control them, usually using violence, coercion, threat, but normally violence. And they use them they maintain that control in order to exploit them. It could be economically, it could be sexually, it could be sort of any way they choose, because they can treat them as if they were a piece of property, which means they can buy them and sell them, they can rent them, they can hand them over, they can leave them to their children, or they can break them to pieces and destroy them, because that's exactly what you can do with anything that belongs to you, that is your property. The one thing that's different, though, about slavery today that's important to have as a foundational piece of information is that for almost all of human history, and Monty lets me have one nerdy statistical chart per talk, and this is it, so we'll get it over with right now. For almost all of human history, slaves have been expensive. They've been the equivalent of a capital purchase item, like going out to buy a tractor or a big truck. So if you look across, the blue line is what it costs to acquire a slave, translated into current US dollars. And the red line is the global population. And there's something has happened in the last 50 to 60 years linked to population and some other trends. But fundamentally what's happened is that after thousands of years of slaves being expensive, they've suddenly become extremely inexpensive. They've stopped being capital purchase items, and they've become disposable inputs. So instead of, you know, the cost and the usage of, say, a big tractor, if you were a farmer, it's more like a styrofoam cup. They're very inexpensive to acquire. You use them as hard as you want, and when you're done with them, it's okay to just crumple them up and throw them away because they're disposable. You can see this very clearly that, you know, if we went back to Richmond, Virginia in 1850, we have really great records of buying and selling slaves and insuring slaves and people being left as slaves in wills to descendants and so forth. So we know exactly what slaves cost in the past, especially in places like Virginia. And if you go back to that time in 1850, in the South, in Virginia, the average price of an average slave was about $1,200 $1850. Now, an average slave at that time was a 19-year-old guy who could work in the fields. So we're not talking about special skill sets or anything like that. We're talking about a guy who could swing a hoe and work in the fields, who was 19. So that's the average slave. What else could you buy in 1850 for $1,250? You could buy a house. You could, not a huge house, but a house. You could buy lots of land, maybe hundreds of acres of land, depending on where you were buying it. You could also buy 6 to 8 oxen. Now, I know that sounds funny, but remember, before you get a lot of steam power, oxen are the biggest, strongest motive force that you could bring to bear on any job you were trying to do, unless you had an elephant, which they didn't have that often in Virginia. So, and $1,200 in $1850 is the equivalent of about $40,000 to $45,000 in today's money. So you can see that people in slavery were expensive and needed some preservation, even if they were treated very badly. They would try to keep them alive because they were a sizable investment. Today, In the last 60 years or so, we've seen this collapse in the cost of acquiring someone into slavery. And it seems to be, in part, very much driven by the fact that the transformation of the world, since I was born, from something like 2.5 billion people on the planet to 7.2 now, has created this vast pool of enslavable people who are living where the rule of law doesn't work, where they are destitute, they may be refugees, there's climatic or environmental destruction. There's a lot of reasons why they're very vulnerable, why they can't necessarily protect themselves. But the point is that there's a big pool. We think something like 600 million people in the world are actually in that pool of potentially enslavable people. And what happens? You guys learned about supply and demand, right? What happens when you flood a market, when you have a glut? The price collapses. And that's exactly what's happened with human beings. So around the world today, the cost of a person averages around $90 to $100. In the United States, if you were trying to acquire a person to use for commercial sexual exploitation or as a domestic servant, you'd probably pay in the low thousands because America's expensive. Could be up even higher than the low, could be upper, but rarely 5 figures. But in other parts of the world, in northern India, I've met families that were enslaved against a cost of about $10 to $20. So we're talking still a collapse and disposability. Okay, now I want to go to the point. I wanted to get those ideas down. Take an easy chair if you like, or front row, always room, right? Now I want to shift over to with that foundation. I want to talk about the work of the new book. I've been going around the world for almost 20 years looking at and meeting people in slavery and studying slavery up close. But it was only not 20 years ago, but more like 10 years ago or less, that I began to look a little more closely as well at what I began to perceive as a pattern. And the pattern was that I saw people in slavery, like these workers in a quarry in India. These are enslaved families working in this quarry, and they're in a form of hereditary slavery. So they've been working there all their lives, their children are working with them, their grandparents work there, and so forth. And I began to realize how much destruction was going on around the world using enslaved labor. This next picture is a pretty remarkable picture because it was taken by a good friend and colleague of mine who's an anti-slavery worker, but this is the slave owner, the slave holder of those families you just saw. And these are those families in that quarry pulled back a little bit in the picture. You'll see that there are little tiny children down here chipping on the way to make the rocks squared off, and these are paving stones. But old people, young people, whole families in there. And he was tricked in sort of showing off, here's my quarry and here are my workers and so forth. Now, again, normally I would be focusing on that human relationship of enslavement. But one of the things about this picture that really sparked me and started me moving in a slightly different direction was that afterwards, after I'd been there, I realized, wait a minute, this is a national forest preserve, which has been set aside and not supposed to ever be cut. This is like Yellowstone National Park, right? But what's going on there is a completely illegal, huge quarry run by a slaveholder, so it's criminally illegal destruction of a national forest using criminally illegal slave labor. And I began to think about other places I'd been and other places I'd worked, and I thought that through, and I began to gather how many examples I could, like this gold mine. This is an open cast gold mine, also in a nationally preserved forest area in Ghana, because there are rare primates that live in this forest in Ghana. And this was once a little streamy river that ran through that forest, which has now been torn all to pieces. It looks like a World War I battlefield because the enslaved workers, including these women on the far side that you can see carrying giant pans of sand and gravel on their heads, are being forced to dig that sand and gravel out of the river pits because they are going to pan that and wash it and use and to get little tiny flecks of gold out of it. So this is open gold mining, like the kind that you would do in 1849 in California if you were a 49er, right? Now, you can see this is enormously destructive to this habitat. They're not just taking away the topsoil, they're going down, down, down to 8, 10 feet. Sometimes they go all the way to the bedrock, making it impossible for anything to happen later. And you know what? That's the least of the problem, because you can't see it with your eye in a picture, but this entire area is saturated with mercury. And mercury is one of the most serious environmental poisons we've got. So this is a poison space. If you don't know, mercury gives you nerve damage. It creates fetal abnormalities in fetuses. It causes liver damage. I mean, one breath of vaporized mercury, if it's heated, can kill you. Just one inhalation of it can kill you. It's really, really bad stuff. And it's really also very seriously bad stuff because it doesn't ever dissipate. You can't boil it out of water. You can't burn it except to turn it into a vapor, which is also dangerous, which then condenses back. If an insect eats a seed with mercury in it, the insect carries the mercury until the bird eats the insect, and then the bird carries the mercury, and then if something eats the bird, it triples up. It's called biomagnification of this concentration of mercury, so that if it ends up in a fish down the line and a person eats the fish, then they get a big dose of mercury, which is why in this country there's suggestions that if you're a pregnant woman, you shouldn't eat certain fish at the high end of the biomagnification level, even for the tiny amount of mercuries that would happen in oceans around here. Anyway, down the stream, I found, when I got past the destructive part, I actually found a village on the banks of that stream, and it turned back into a stream, and they were watering their vegetable gardens from this river. They were drinking from it. They were using that water for cooking. There was a church there. They were even baptizing people in it. I mean, it was an environmental and health disaster that they had no clue was about to fall upon their head. And I began to wonder, what if all of this isn't just a single example here or an anecdote there? I begin to think, since I'm seeing it in so many countries, let me go back and see what I can find if this is really a pattern. Let me see if I can sum up in the ways that Monty and I often work, trying to work with aggregated information to discover if it's not just an anomaly, but something that's a pattern. So let me go first to give you an example how I've been discovering how this fits together, to a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A UNESCO World Heritage Site is one of the places on the planet Earth that the whole world and the UN and everybody has decided this needs absolute special protection, right? So a place like Angkor Wat in Cambodia that has amazing ruins, or some of the biggest castles in Europe, and so forth, or some of the most beautiful mountain ranges of the world, have been designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And that means the governments, not just the local government, but global governments are dedicated to protecting those sites forever. So at the bottom of Bangladesh is one that you may not have ever heard of, called the Sundarbans Islands, or the Sundarban Forests, or the Sundarban UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I'm going to start way up in the sky and let you look down at one of this. So the Sundarbans are an enormous mangrove forest, the largest mangrove forest in Asia. And it's also the largest carbon sink in Asia. Does everybody know what a carbon sink is? No? Good, thank you. A carbon sink is a place where, normally, a carbon sink is a place where you have trees, and so many trees, because trees pull carbon dioxide out of the air. It's a place where you have so many trees that they pull more carbon dioxide out of the air than carbon dioxide is being made in them or around them. So it's like a place, instead of a place where you have a growth of carbon dioxide, you actually have a reduction of carbon dioxide. So that's why it's called a sink, right? So this enormous area, which is many, many tens of thousands of square miles across Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar, is the largest carbon sink in Asia. And it's supposed to be protected forever for a lot of reasons, including endangered species. But as you can see from this photo, this satellite photo, the right side, the forest is intact, but on the edge of this estuary, you can see that there are something else going on here. And what's happening is all those little things are fishing boats. And these are raised paths where their catch is being brought up to this fish processing camp. And what look like buildings aren't buildings. I'm going to show you what they are in a second. And when I say fish processing, that makes it sound like there's a big factory with machines that can process this. No. These are the entire processing camp works on child slave labor. So what looked like might have looked like buildings when you saw it from the satellite are in fact enormous drying racks that have been put up where the children have taken knives, set up all day and all night, cutting, cleaning, and then hanging the fish out to dry. You notice in the background there are some very high racks as well that you have to climb up. Well, this is a remarkable photograph taken by a very brave Bangladeshi human rights photographer, but this is a slave driver driving child slaves as they work up and down the drying racks. So he's beating them to keep them moving fast and keep them going like that. Those children, like these boys, you know, if they're not doing the racks, they're sitting on the ground, and they have to work as long as the fish come in. So as long as the fish are coming in, they have to keep cutting and cleaning. They get exhausted, they fall asleep, they cut themselves. They're sitting in fish guts, great piles of goopy fish guts. It's a terrible, cold, exhausting, and they don't even get very much to eat to do any of this stuff. I was able to talk to 4 of these boys the morning after they had escaped from slavery on one of these fish processing islands. They had stowed away on a fishing boat. One of the boys had actually bumped into someone he knew from his village who was fishing on that fishing boat and convinced him to hide them away. And so the night before they'd hidden away on this fishing boat and had come up toward the mainland, still not to the mainland, but I happened to be at a village which was inaccessible except by river when they landed that morning. And I was able to talk to them all separately, aged 9 to 14. And I talked to them about their lives in this camp. And we talked about a lot of things and how they came to be there and what their families were thinking and how they'd been tricked and so forth. But I want to just focus on one little thing, which is, or not little, but one serious thing, which is that, you know, one thing I asked them about, what about your well-being? What about your health? And they talked about the beatings, the regular beatings. They talked about how some of the smallest children were sexually assaulted by the guards or slave drivers at night. I asked about their health, and they all said, well, the most serious problem we had was diarrhea. I mean, they didn't really have a name beyond diarrhea. They didn't know if it was flu or whatever, but they said everybody had diarrhea a lot of the time. And all of the children said that they knew other children who had died on the island while they were there of diarrhea. When I asked them if, you know, after the diarrhea, what was the most serious problem they had? Well, this was the part that, honestly, it just blew my mind when they told me what the second most serious problem was. Because they said, every child that I spoke to, separately, mind you, told me that they had either witnessed or knew another child who had been eaten by a tiger. Now, at the time, I just couldn't quite grasp this. But as I began to think it through, I realized, no, this was in fact the perfect example of exactly the topic that I was trying to understand. Because the Sundarban World Heritage Site, one of the reasons it's a World Heritage Site is because it's the last best breeding ground of the endangered Bengal tigers. It's this amazing species of tigers that we want to preserve, and yet this is where they live and where they're supposed to be protected. And that it wasn't about the tigers being particularly ferocious or anti-child, it was because that was where they lived, that was their place, and when criminals had come in and cut down the forest, driving away their normal prey animals, and then had introduced small mammals called children into their space, it really shouldn't have been a surprise that tigers began to take those children as their prey animals. It was a classic example of what happens when you have criminals who are as happy to destroy the lives of children as they are to destroy the lives, the natural world, and even, you know, potentially the lives of protected species like Bengal tigers. Now, I think you're getting the idea of this deep, horrific, vicious cycle of slavery, environmental destruction, leading to more slavery, leading to more environmental destruction. But the third leg to that particular stool that I want you to understand is, everywhere I studied this, it wasn't being driven just by criminality. It was being driven because of our purchasing patterns. Because where was this fish going? Or where were the shrimp going that were coming from the shrimp farms, which were also destroying the mango forest? Well, they were coming to us. The shrimp of Bangladesh, Thailand, southern India are packed and cleaned and processed and frozen and shipped to North America and Western Europe. Things like the dried fish often end up in local markets, but they also end up in cat food. Who has a cat? Okay, sorry. I just wanted to say sorry. You're going to have a talk with your cat about vegan alternatives. And they don't like that, right? They don't like that. I know how cats are. And even this cat, you can say, you only felt a little guilty when I talked to this cat about that. But then cats are the epitome of indifference, right? Even on human rights issues. But you need to talk to Masala about this, okay? I know his cat. Let me jump to another space for a moment and not give you something quite as shocking as that. All across India, Pakistan, Nepal, and into China, there's a belt around where those countries come together, particularly geologically of a kind of deep clay soil. And that clay is very good for making bricks. And if you take a look from way up high, you can actually pick these brick kilns out in satellite imagery. If you go on Google Earth, you can find these giant brick kilns. Here's a diagram to show you what it looks like. Basically, you can see how big a person is. I put in a person for scale. But up here in the firing zone, what happens is you have people who are enslaved workers stacking. They dig the clay mud. They mix it up. They pack it into molds. They shape them into bricks. They let them dry a little bit. It's exactly, if you've ever read Exodus in the Bible, it's exactly what the Jews were made to do by the Pharaoh, which was to do the same sort of things. They just didn't have giant kilns like this big. But then they stack them up, and then the fire is fed through holes in the top, and it just moves around this track month after month, going around and around. Behind the fire, after the bricks have cooled down, then they take them away to sell, and meanwhile the slave-made bricks are being stacked up in front of the fire as it goes round and round. Children work in these places. These are normally, again, whole families that are caught up in this kind of slavery. And the thing that I wanted to point to with the brick kilns is just that it's not so much about the destruction of forests or deforestation. It does have some significant environmental impacts in that area, but the serious problem has to do with what's used for fuel in the brick kilns. So you have these chimneys, and then you go around the area, and you just see more and more and more and more. There's thousands and thousands and thousands, and many tens of thousands of these chimneys. What do you think they're using to fuel these brick kilns? Well, you would think coal, wood. The truth is they use two key power sources: used motor oil and old tires. Now, if you know anything about the chemistry of all that, you know that used motor oil, well, there's a reason there's a law in Virginia that you can't just dump your used motor oil, right? It has to be disposed of properly. They still have that law, right? Even though the Republican governor, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know. It's just that used motor oil is full of incredibly carcinogenic chemicals. It's a serious poison that is, in most places, is treated as something you have to very carefully set aside, and it has to go through a whole process of cleansing and re-refinement and so forth. Likewise, in the United States, if a fire breaks out in a place where old tires are stored, that's a Class 1 federal emergency, because the smoke and the liquid that comes from burning tires that seeps into the soil is, again, saturated with carcinogens and a lot of other poisonous chemicals. And you can't even reclaim the soil. You just have to make a boundary and pour concrete over it and seal it off, because the EPA says that's a Class 1 emergency. It requires immediate federal response and so forth. It's a terrible way to do anything, but because it's completely unregulated, because it's criminals using slave labor, because it's criminals often doing it in protected nature reserves, none of the laws get enforced. And where does all that go? It goes into the building booms that are going on in places like India, where you have a rapidly growing middle class, people want to build new houses, a lot of things are happening, they're building them up, often with slave-made bricks. Last key example I want to show you. In the Amazon, we know about the fact that, we want to save the Amazon, right? This has been a long time cry, so, save the Amazon. And we know that those forests are legally protected in lots of ways and have been supported in their protection by lots of people, even in the United States. Now again, a shot taken by an astronaut out of his window, this is a bit of the Amazon. It's not a great picture, but that river is the Xingu River, which is one of the rivers south of the Amazon, often seen as one of the boundaries to the true and untouched Amazonian forest. But this is only from 3 or 4 years ago, and as you can see, there are fires burning in the Amazonian forest there, so large that you can easily see huge swaths of fire burning in that supposedly absolutely protected forest. The Xingu is also important because way back in the 1950s, the land that's north of the Xingu, and especially if I have my geography right, on the right side of the screen, was all set aside by the Brazilian government to be the complete and total property of indigenous tribal peoples back in the 1950s. So that was all supposed to be protected that way. And the other parts were set aside for other reasons, but supposed to be untouched. Now, this is a map which I appreciate is a little funny looking, but if you bear with me for a moment, it's a powerful kind of picture. So this isn't a map of Brazil. This is a map of the southern half, as it were, of the Amazonian basin. And that purpley line at the top, that's the Amazon. That purpley line at the top, that's the Amazon. The green on this map are parts of the Amazon basin, the Great Amazon Forest, that have been set aside and protected and supposed to be protected for all time, because it is the lungs of the planet. It is the most amazing space of biodiversity on the whole planet. If they're that way, they're green. The yellow parts are the parts of that protected special forest which have now been cut, and cut illegally. So what you see here is the ongoing destruction of that special forest that we're all supposed to be behind holding on to. The purpley bits at the bottom, the magenta or violet or whatever that color is, are areas that weren't necessarily protected, okay? Now, what are the dots? The blue dots, this is where this map becomes even though it becomes like an action piece. The blue dots are slavery cases. And the bigger the blue dot, the more slaves. So if you look, for example, can I point right up there where you have a circle of red dots and one big blue dot? That's the size of that dot means there's at least 50 people enslaved in that busted slavery case. But I need to be very clear with you. These dots, you have to understand, are only the ones that the authorities knew about. And all the human rights workers and the environmentalist workers in the Amazon will tell you they don't catch half of what's going on in slavery or in terms of the red dots, which are murders. So a classic example of what we're seeing here is that you can see that one big blue dot that I pointed to. You can see that it's surrounded by almost 11, I think, murder cases that were known about. And you can also see that that slavery and those murders are sitting on top of almost a circle of yellowness, which means that was part of a criminal gang operating in a very large scale in the destruction of a protected forest. Now, if we zoom down a little bit, but not all the way to the ground, one of the ways that they destroy this forest is by cutting the trees, clear cutting the trees, as you can see on this side, in order to make charcoal. So there's the greenery trees are left on that side, no trees on this side. Those little bumps are charcoal ovens where they're turning trees into charcoal. Let me go, you'll see what they look like here. So there you can see those little clay ovens which they build on site. And you can see here, that's an enslaved worker who is taking is taking a load of freshly produced charcoal. You make charcoal by burning wood in an oven, but keeping the oxygen supply very low so that it retains carbon to burn. So he's loading it into the back of a truck to be taken away. Charcoal? They're destroying the entire Amazon for barbecue? No, because in Brazil, charcoal is needed in vast amounts to supply the Brazilian iron and steel industry. Brazil sadly has a lot of iron ore, but it has virtually no coal or coke, the two other fossil fuels that are normally used to convert iron ore into iron and iron into steel. So a long time ago, I think because there was a time when Brazilians just assumed that they had an infinite supply of wood and forests, they said, well, that's okay, we can still make steel here because we can make it with charcoal. We can cut down our forests and make charcoal. In Brazil, I was told by a number of people who had been enslaved in the forests about how it seemed to be almost not a new type of slavery, but a new wrinkle on slavery, which was fairly short-term, like almost temp agency slavery, where out of work, hungry young men would be told, hey, I've got a great job, we can go and do some wood clearing, I've got a legal permit, don't worry about it, come with me. And they would be taken into the forest, and then once they were way up in the forest, they wouldn't even see a gun yet, but they would be fed very little, worked very hard, begin to get sick, sometimes injured. And when they tried to leave, that's when the gun would come out, and they say, well, you can't leave until we let you. And over, I was told the story by young men who had been enslaved, sometimes for not more than 6 weeks, until they began to break down just from hunger and often disease as well. And also, by the time enough of the land had been cleared and the best types of woods removed and so forth, that they'd be abandoned. They'd just drive off and abandon them. Or, and this was very common, they would say, unlucky people would often just be told they were going to be walked out to the road, but instead would be walked into the forest, shot, and put in shallow graves. So while I was there, I was out with, I guess you could call these guys CSI Amazonia or something like that. But they had just working on a tip from someone who had been working in the forest legally that they had discovered more shallow graves with ex-slaves who had been executed. They had been disposed of. They're disposable enslaved people. And we went and found these young guys. If you looked at the skulls, you could tell from the teeth they were young. They were probably in their teens or 20s, and you could tell exactly how they died because they had a bullet hole that started here and came out here. All three of them there. Where does all that go? Well, most of Brazilian steel and iron comes to Western Europe and the United States, and it's made into body parts for cars, car parts, plumbing fixtures, stuff like that. Right? So, you're now totally depressed. I get that. I want to just tell you, we're over the most depressing stuff. We're going to turn the corner and show how this horrific, vicious cycle of slavery and environmental destruction actually has within the knowledge of that linkage some new ideas that can help us to stop both of them. The first thing, though, is to just let you see the global size. So I looked at, in the book, I go to a number of other countries, we look at it across the world, but we also, in this work, took those ideas and we began to analyze it globally, at the global level, particularly using the United Nations information that comes from what's called RED, the Reforestation and Deforestation, or I can't remember how but anyway, it's the UN RED program, which measures how much deforestation goes on. But if you add all that together and you use the conservative end of every estimate, and I mean very conservative end, the last thing I want to do is overstate any problem. But if you say, well, let's add this up and say, well, if slavery were a country or an American state, remember 36 million people, right? So 36 million people in the world in slavery, if they were all in one country, it would be a country with the population of Canada, or a country, or an American state with the population of California. So we're not talking about a huge country. in terms of population. Likewise, we believe from the UN ILO that slavery puts about $150 billion a year into the global economy. So you could say the gross domestic product of the country called slavery would be about the same as Angola, which is not a super rich country, or Kansas, which I have to say even surprised me. I didn't think Kansas put that much into the global economy, but it does, okay. So it wouldn't just be a smallish country, it would be a small, fairly poor country in the sense that it wouldn't have a great amount of economic activity, a great amount of production. A small, low production, fairly low production country or American state. But if it were a country, if you add up all the CO2 emission that comes from slave-based enterprises, especially and particularly deforestation, it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 after China and the United States. Now, that's again, on one hand, a horrific statement, and on the other hand, it actually opens up the potential for some solutions. And one of the ways that it opens up a solution is, remember that when it comes to, if China puts out 7 billion tons of CO2 and the US puts out 5.5 billion tons, that's bad enough as it is. But remember that there's more than a billion Chinese people, but only 300 million Americans, which tells you that currently the world champion individual CO2 emitters are you guys, right? Actually, a lot of it's down to you and your daddy's Escalade, right? That big Cadillac Escalade your daddy gave, okay, yeah. Yeah, I know, I'm just messing, I know. But, the point is, Americans are known as per capita the biggest CO2 emitters in the world, which we are. But if slavery were a country, slaves would outdistance us by 8 times, that much more CO2 per emission per individual. But again, here's the important twist to this. If you have a really small fraction of the global population, 36 million out of 7.2 billion, who are doing something, and they're doing it something that is both illegal in itself, and they are in fact in an illegal status, which we've all agreed they shouldn't be in, then it becomes easier to say, my goodness, here's a way to address both these problems by using the laws that exist in every single country and our international laws that spread all around the planet. And if we direct those laws at those people who are forced to do these things, which are so damaging to the planet and so dangerous with climate change and CO2 emission, and we use those laws to help those people come out of slavery, every time they come out of slavery, they become not one of the greatest emitters on the planet, but probably one of the lowest. Now, this will work, that can work, because it's all about these trees. One of the things that I discovered in this work is that one of the reasons we have this problem today is because we made some big mistakes a few years ago. And what I'm referring to is that over the last 20 or so years, there have been a series of environmental regulations, treaties, and laws which pretty much slowed or stopped deforestation, timbering, in a lot of countries around the world. They really slowed it down or almost completely stopped it. And there were great regulations and treaties and so forth that helped, in which rich countries helped poor countries to set aside enormous areas of virgin forest, especially in the richest, the parts of the world that had the biggest forests. I remember in Gambia there was a huge swath, hundreds of square miles of untouched forest that was set aside, and a poor country like Gambia did so because they were given resources to set that aside by rich countries as a way to preserve the carbon sink of that forest. But what we didn't do, and I say that all of us, what we didn't do as the world, was that when we helped so many countries around the equator set aside their forests, we didn't provide for adequate protections for those forests. So when the legal forestry deforestation stopped, criminals said, well, let's just go get the really big trees in the really great places like the national forests, like the protected parks. And because there were only 3 forest rangers who shared 1 bicycle, because that was pretty, and that sounds like a joke, but it's often the case, there was no real protection. It's a lot like the game reserves in East Africa, where you have elephant poachers who want their ivory, who have small airplanes, four-wheel drive vehicles, whole teams of people with automatic weapons and radios and walkie-talkies, up against two rangers with a bicycle. I mean, it'll be literally that kind of disparity. And it's not surprising that people continue to kill elephants and take their ivory. The result being the deforestation's proceeding at a faster rate than was ever even assumed to happen. And it's also happening in those places where we haven't been paying as much attention because they're not as dramatic as they could be. So, you know, that's a Brazil nut tree in Brazil. And there it just looks from the distance like a big tree. But in fact, we're a long way off from that tree because Brazil nut trees grow to be as much as 800 years old. And it would take, you know, all the people sitting on this side of the room holding their arms like this to go around the trunk of one of those trees. They're enormous. And they're amazing, right? They're just an amazing tree. And they're huge. As you can see, those are very tall trees underneath that tree, right? And those are sort of those are high-story trees, and below that grow other trees at another level, and so forth. Meanwhile, these little mangrove trees are about 10, 20 feet tall, maybe. And they grow almost shrub-like over the vast areas of the Sundarbans. But why is that important to us? Why are those little scrubby ones important? Because mangroves are 4 times better at taking carbon out of the air and storing it than those gigantic deciduous trees of the Amazon. Why? Because one of the reasons we love our trees is they suck carbon out of the air and they turn it into wood, and then the wood sits there for a long time. But sooner or later, when the tree dies, it falls over, it lets the carbon back into the air. Mangrove trees take carbon out of the air, process it, and then release it through its water-covered roots as a carbonate, a kind of, think of it as a carbon crystal that they put into the water. And then it's stable. It mixes into the world's oceans. It can come back out, but it doesn't come back out instantly. And they process much more of that carbon out and through and into the oceans than deciduous trees even in the Amazon can do. Now, I'm sorry about more than 3 words on a slide. I don't like to have more than 3 words on a slide. But just to kind of lock that concept down, right now, we put about 48% more CO2 into the air than forests could suck out of the air, right? And the whole idea is, you know, this is after 50, 60, 100 years ago when there was enough forest in the world to pull the same amount of carbon out of the air that was being put out by human activity. So we had a balance. We had something like a carbon balance. And we were below the 350 parts per million that is sort of the magic number when it comes to atmospheric carbon. But now we're way over 350. We're up in that space where, I don't know where we are. Does anyone know where we are today? 430? Nobody know? Okay, doesn't matter. Think about 430, I think. Once you're above 350, you get global warming. When you get above that, you get climate change. Things begin to happen that we don't like. And the more slavery there is, and the more deforestation, illegal deforestation that occurs through slave labor there is, you both release more carbon when you cut the forest down, and you remove those machines that take carbon out of the air, called trees. So the more that we have, when we have more slavery and more deforestation, the more likely we are to have we'll have an increasing rise in the CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's where we don't want to go. That's melted icebergs, that's flooded coastlines, that's all the bad stuff that we're trying to avoid. But if we flip this around, right? If we take that vicious cycle and turn it around and make it run the other direction and say, we're going to stop the slavery because that's our legal right to do so, and there's actually we know how to do that. We're going to stop that slavery, which is going to stop the deforestation. And if we even then pay freed slaves to replant forests, we'll turn that vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle and make it run the opposite direction. And you'll be expanding the forests, absorbing more carbon, maybe as much as committed. We'll get to that point where I've used the word redemption because I was at a Catholic university yesterday, but redemption, by the word redemption, I mean in particular what's known as the energy balance, the point where we're living in a way that doesn't continuously exacerbate the problem that we're facing. Right? Now, wait a minute. You're thinking, really? We're going to stop all this slave labor, then we're going to have pay them to replant the forests and so forth? Is this realistic? Well, it is actually, and I'll tell you why. Because we actually know how to get people out of slavery. We've had 20 years of good global experience of all the different ways to get people out of slavery now. But also, we know how to save the environment because we had a movie from Al Gore, right, that told us all exactly what we needed to do to completely save the environment. But in fact, you can put a lot of these things together in a win-win. Here's just one example. The book has got a lot more examples. But do you know what a carbon credit is? Are you familiar with this, a carbon credit? Okay. So Montai, as usual, is owning a dirty factory, and he's putting a lot of CO2 into the air. And in fact, he's putting more CO2 in the air than American law will allow him to from his factory. So he can either spend millions of dollars putting special scrubbers on his smokestacks, but he doesn't want to do that. So, because he's got a crappy product anyway, and he's going out of business. So he can't do that. So anyway, he wants to keep producing. So instead of cleaning up his own mess, he goes over here and he buys a carbon credit. And a carbon credit is basically someone who is doing something that sucks as much carbon out of the air as he's putting into the air. And one of the fundamental ways that works, when it works, is through planting forests. There are some controversial things about carbon credits. I don't want to dodge that. But there are different types of carbon credits. But the type that's most simple and understandable is you plant a lot of trees and they begin to suck the carbon out of the air. Now here's the thing. When I calculated up how much carbon credit would be produced or be available if you just took the forests that we know have been destroyed by slave labor and you asked people who had come out of slavery to pay them to replant those forests, the potential would be something like 68 billion in carbon credits. So you would get people who had dirty factories like this guy paying the people to plant the forests. Now, I don't know if it'd be 68 because the price of oil collapsed in the last little while and those two prices are linked, but it would probably be 55. And the current total volume of carbon credits is about 130 billion, so we're not talking about blowing the top off the market or anything. So in other words, in an existing economic system in which we can reduce carbon as a balancing act to carbon coming out, we could use that to get people out of slavery, pay them, and so forth. And we know this is great because all of our estimates on what it would cost to get people out of slavery, even if we didn't have carbon credits, never go over about 25 billion. And I mean all 36 million people. If we helped everyone in the world come out of slavery, the highest estimates we have of the cost of that process over, say, 30-year period is something like 25 billion. So the numbers are kind of looking good. I gave this talk in Boston about a week ago, and afterwards these people kind of surrounded me and said, we're with a major capital investment fund and we want to talk about this. Because they were seeing dollar signs in their own eyes about doing good at the same time. Okay, last couple of slides just to show some of this stuff is already underway. So this is José. He's a farmer in Brazil. But the cool thing about José is that he is an ex-slave. He's an ex-landless peasant. He was born into a peasant family in rural Brazil that had no land, which meant they were completely dependent on other people and often literally sleeping in gutters, in rural gutters. He was then, as a young man, caught up in slavery, once in deforestation, once in a mine. And then sometime later, he was able to connect with a church-based development agency that had set up a farmers cooperative. And they helped him to get, through a government program, access to some land. Now, it's a good thing that the Brazilian government does, because the scheme that they operate, the program that they operate says, you know, we're going to give you, but not let you own. We don't let you own this land, but we're going to give you access to use the land like a lease. And we're going to give you 200 acres of absolutely virgin Amazonian forests. But here's the deal. you can only cut 5 acres in this forest. You can cut 5 acres to have a place to put your house and put your vegetable gardens, maybe some fruit trees, maybe a few chickens and cows on that 5 acres. But the other 195 acres, it's free for you to use in ways where you sustainably harvest and serve the forest and let the forest serve you. So underneath those gigantic Brazil nut trees are, again, high canopy trees. But down under the next layer, under the canopy trees, guess what one of the naturally occurring trees is? Cocoa trees. And you can plant cocoa trees in 100 acres of forest to the point that you have hundreds of cocoa trees. And cocoa trees, after their 3rd year, begin to produce cocoa beans. And the reason why Jose is looking so cocky is that he has gone from being an absolute hungry, destitute guy full of malaria and parasites and his kids and his wife to being a healthy guy who's got a decent house and plumbing and a refrigerator and a motorcycle, and his kids are in school, and it's all because of those cocoa beans that are in the bags behind him. And he was totally excited about this. He had clothes to wear that he'd never had more than one set of clothes. I mean, the whole thing. It cracked me up when after we had these conversations and he left, and the people who ran the cooperative said to me, and you know, he's not a very good farmer. He's like one of our worst farmers. He's lazy. He likes to talk about how cool he is, but he's not as cool as he says. He was a great guy, but he said, you know, there are farmers who get 3 times as much cocoa as he does. And the other thing about it was that even though they didn't know it until I told them, they were producing organic fair trade cocoa. They just weren't, they didn't have the certificates. But by planting the trees in the forest, not as monoculture, where they give each other tree diseases, they were growing healthy, happy cocoa trees as well. Here's another picture. So, do you remember the enslaved workers in the quarry at the beginning of my talk? These are the same people. They got free with work from a local NGO. And as you can see with that little boy carrying that tree out, they made a ceremony of the day that they began to replant the forest. When we said to them, you know, what do you want to do as they came out of slavery as a village, they did what every village does, which says, first thing we want is a school. Because they truly and rightly believe that if you have a school and your kids can go to school, education will make them unenslavable. They think education will make them slave-proof, and it normally does. But the second thing they wanted to do, they said, was we heard from our grandparents that this used to be a forest, and we want to have the forest back. We heard from the old people that in the old days, around our village, there were these trees, and these trees would give you fruit, and they would give you fiber to weave into baskets, and they would give you fodder for your animals, and they would give you fuel to burn, to cook with, and they would give you wood that you could make furniture out of. And we want to have all those trees back, because that would make us into a happy, healthy village again. So they know how to do it. I mean, it wasn't that they were even asked to do it. They said, we really want to do this. In that situation, we actually got some money from the World Bank to buy them the trees. But, you know, if we had known about how to do it with carbon credits, we could have done it that way too. I stopped it, and I'll stop it right here with that last froze the frame on the guy in the slightly Western clothes, because I just think he's great. Because that's the forest ranger that was bribed by the slaveholder to turn a blind eye for all those years as he destroyed the forest. And I thought it was very, very kind of these villagers. When they came to freedom, they said to him, look, we're not going to beat you up, even though a lot of us want to, because we understand that you were under the thumb of the same powerful and criminal person that was controlling our lives. But the one thing that you need to understand is you don't work for him anymore. You work for the forest, and you work for us. We live in the forest, you live in the forest, and from now on, you're going to have to answer to the women who live in this village, and you better do what they say, or you'll be in big trouble. So that's the fundamental ideas around this book. This is what the book looks like. We've got a whole bunch of them right over there. I'll stop there and take your questions. Pam.
Previous slide, you said there was Mercury going on.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there Mercury
Why mercury? Oh, that's a good question. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that. If you take sand or gravel or stone that's got gold in it, you almost never find nuggets, right? You find they're tiny flecks of gold. So if you take like hard rock that has gold ore that has gold in it, you smash it up into a fine powder. If you then mix that powder with water and then mix mercury into that water, mercury bonds with gold. So mercury will absorb something like 5 times its own weight in gold. Some geological chemist will have to explain the mechanism why that happens. I don't know. I couldn't. But basically, and when you do that, because I've watched it done, you stir it all together, and all of a sudden the gold is being sucked out by the mercury, and it turns into something that doesn't look anything like mercury, not silver. It turns into this waxy-looking stuff. And it feels kind of waxy, and you kind of roll, you keep mixing it, and then the waxy ball gets bigger and bigger until you've got most of the gold out of the sand, or then you get rid of the other stuff, which still has a little mercury in it, and then you squeeze the mercury out of that waxiness, and then it drips everywhere and poisons people, until finally you have this little hard thing, and then you burn that to burn off the mercury, and that's when you better stand back, because if you breathe a little of that, it'll kill you. And then at the end of the day, you have this little lumpy, smushy stuff, which if you then superheat that, you get a little drop of gold, of pure gold. So that's why mercury. Yes. Oh, how carbon credits are funded? As I understand it, national governments do buy carbon credits, but also corporations and industries buy carbon credits. And I've been trying to figure out this whole carbon credit market, and I have to say it's pretty complex, and a lot of it is manipulated by international models. But I do know, talking to some people who knew more about it, that there's nothing unreasonable about the idea that you could take carbon credits from reforestation from an NGO base, say, and make it work. Sorry? Oh, yes. Yeah, they do work internationally. Yes?
You mentioned that some NGOs will help turn these bad situations around.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any barriers or conflicts that come into an international NGO, maybe an American-based NGO, trying to help another country in their national plans? Can you take an organization based somewhere else and try to help people in Central Africa? Or can you not do that?
Yeah, your question is about, just to make sure everyone heard, is about, if you're talking about NGOs and they're doing this work on the ground to get people out of slavery and do environmental work as well, can they cross borders? Can an American NGO go down and do that work? And the answer is yes, sometimes they can. Sometimes they can't. They're not allowed to in countries. But best practice is that they don't. The best practice is that if a U.S. NGO is going to try to do that, they do it with local NGOs. They don't tell them what to do. They ask them, what's the best thing you can do, and how can we help you and support you to make that happen? At first, I actually thought your question was going to be about the real threats and barriers, which are between the NGO workers and the people who would like to kill them for getting in their way. So, particularly in Brazil, you saw those slaves who had been killed for being slaves, basically. But I have to tell you, while I was there, not long before I was there, an American nun named Dorothy Stang, who had been working there for 20 years, was assassinated. And it wasn't like a random murder. This was a very obvious assassination because of her anti-slavery and pro-environmental work. And while I was there, an older couple that I knew who had set up a demonstration farm and were stopping illegal loggers from coming into a large part of the Amazon, they were assassinated. And again, it was a very obvious assassination. The man who had paid the assassins was later convicted, but only after an American had made a film that exposed the entire situation and so forth. Every year, 10 to 20 people are assassinated by criminal gangs for trying to either get people out of slavery or preserve forests in Brazil. So it's a war, it's a real war. Yes, ma'am. She's asking, well, there's a number of different ways to get people out of slavery. What are they? And there's actually lots of different ways. I won't go into all of them, but let me just explain that you need to have different mechanisms or or procedures for getting people out of slavery, depending on what type of slavery it is and who's enslaved. So just a couple of examples. There's a type of slavery where individual children are locked into small rooms and weaving carpets in northern India and southern Pakistan, right? Carpet slaves, making carpets for export. And like I say, it's individual kids locked into little individual rooms with a carpet loom where they work. The only way you can get those people out of slavery is you have to watch to see when the slaveholders happen to be away from that place. You go there, you kick the door in, you grab the kid, and you take them away in a hurry, and you try to do quite a few kids at once because there'll be a bunch of those kids with looms. And you take them to a rehabilitation center. You go by way of a police station so they can be registered as rescued. And then you start the process of physical care, medical care, teaching, everything they need, and then you reunite them with their families. Okay. On the other hand, those people in that village that were in the quarry had been in a hereditary form of slavery that had lasted many generations. We don't even know how many. And it was the entire families and an entire community that was held in bondage. Now that takes a different, you know, there's no door to kick in, right? You can't, you'd need like 3 or 4 buses to take them all away. It wouldn't work that way. You have to do that by a community organizing model. And you actually have people there who are of their ethnicity, their religious basis, speak their language, and often are ex-slaves themselves, who then go there very quietly in a way that people don't even notice they're showing up there because they dress exactly the same way. They look like they're part of the community. But they start this conversation about, you know, there's another way, right? You know, you could have a school, right? You know, you could have 3 meals a day, that kind of thing. And it takes a while. But, you know, it's about finding the right way. In the United States, it's about often linking together people through media of different sorts to find out, to put something in a motel bathroom that helps a woman know that if she texts this number, it's going to go to Polaris Project through the hotline, which will lead to a police officer stopping by, you know. So there's those ways as well. So sorry, there's a lot to that. Yes.
I actually have 2 questions. One is more theoretical, one is more technical.
Yeah.
My first question is, what's the link, or is there a link between the environment and corruption, local corruption with the manipulated or
Yeah.
manipulating
Yeah. Let me answer that question first. So is there a link between corruption and environmental destruction? Yes. I mean, you can almost always say that, right? Because when the rule of law fails, which is what one of the key ideas about corruption is, basically it's people acting with impunity and destroying the rule of law by corrupting it. That means you can corrupt it into selling off public forests, for example, but privately, even though it's public, and you just put the money in your pocket. And just after my book came out, I actually had an email that I just answered this morning from a nun in Romania who was saying she was watching this beautiful protected forest in Romania being just slashed and burned by criminals because local officials were very happy to take a backhand or take a bribe to make that happen. What's your second question? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's because why did it look like only the southern side was being destroyed? And the answer is because I didn't show you the whole Amazon basin. The Amazon basin goes far to the north, and it also goes further to the west, right? And this is just this yellow with the murder and the slavery. Think of it as like a big steel scythe of criminality cutting into the forest. But if we were to expand this map, if we could, wider and wider to the west and to the north, you would basically see this line of destruction, murder, and slavery would just make a giant ring around the Amazon. So it would go all the way over into Peru and Ecuador, where the Amazon extends up into the mountains, and it would go across the top into Colombia. So, yeah, it's only because it was a snapshot of the map. Yeah. What's another question? Yes?
What strategies do you use to I guess preserve your own well-being? You're looking so closely at something that just hearing about it is somewhat difficult, in a short session that you're getting today. So when you spend years of your life here going through this, what do you do so you don't fall into despair?
It's a good question. And I mean, how can I stomach doing this? And I often get people asking me, like, how can you bear to keep doing this? And I'll tell you that when I started doing this work and I first confronted some of the really horrible parts of slavery, I was working in Thailand and I was working with around teenage girls who were caught up in a working class brothel, nothing to do with sex tourism, and they were being, it was gang rape plus torture plus murder plus HIV, right? I mean, it was about as bad as it could get. And I have to say, it messed me up. And I had previously worked in prisons, and I had previously worked on death row, and I thought I was tough. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't handle it. It was too much for me. And it did mess my head up a bit, and I needed to do some work to get past that. But the other reason why it works, and I can work, is because when I was doing that first work, I would see these horrific, terrible things in front of me, but I couldn't do anything about them. I was powerless in the face of this because I was there just as a researcher. And when I finished all of that work, and I did it in lots of parts of the world, and I published a book called Disposable People, and got that information and knowledge out there, I said to myself, if I'm going to keep doing this, I have to know that I have to make a balance in this. I can't just be an observer. I have to do something to change the situation. So I actually took leave for almost 10 years from my academic work and started this anti-slavery organization that gets people out of slavery every day, right? Now, maybe they're not getting the people out of slavery that I'm talking to today, but I know that even though I'm talking to people in slavery over here or seeing this horrible situation, that over there people are coming out of slavery. And that makes a sufficient balance. Because I have to tell you, you don't get much better job satisfaction than at the end of the week you get the email with the picture that says these 18 children just came out of slavery, right? And now they're in a school, and here they are being reunited with their mothers, right? I mean, that helps to balance it up. But it can be tough at times. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So with the exception of child slavery, systemic, are there any uprisings against slavery? There's so many slaves and so many owners there.
That's a great question. I mean, he's asking about, in situations where you have lots of slaves and so few owners, why aren't there uprisings, right, against the slavery? But the fundamental answer to that is that it's very rare, and it's very rare because of the nature of the way slavery works. Because one of the things, when we think about people in slavery, we often think about, like, what would it be like if I were in slavery? Well, I'm strong. I would do something about it. I would fight back. But what we forget about is that if I were to enslave you, the first thing I would do is just beat the crap out of you. I would knock you unconscious. I would seriously injure you. I would have other people helping me do that. And then I would not let you sleep. This is very common in slaveholding, the sleep deprivation. And everybody knows, you guys have pulled all-nighters. You know how sort of addled and confused you get after you have no sleep for 15, 20, whatever, right? And I would also keep you from eating. So you starve people, keep them sleep deprived, and then assault them. And sometimes you assault them in ways that also make them feel degraded, like sexually assault them. Right? Now you take someone and you break them like that, and you hold them in a state in which that brokenness is never given an opportunity to heal. But you also might then occasionally reward them with a little bit of this or a little bit of that to breed Stockholm syndrome, so that they will identify you as both the source but also the potential person who can deliver them from pain. And it becomes pretty tough for them to start thinking clearly and strategically about how to rebel. It happens occasionally and people escape, but it's tough. Yeah, it's tough. Yes?
You mentioned local programs like the program
In some, she's asking about are there other types of programs happening through international law and other organizations that are at a global level? And the answer is yes, a little bit. It's just not at the level or amount that we need. It's a good problem that we have in some ways, in that if this were a disease that was a global serious disease like smallpox, we would be at the stage where we actually know how to do the vaccine, and we would know where the disease is, but we just didn't have the money to scale up, right? It would be like we knew how to make the disease, but the vaccine, but we didn't have enough money to make the 1 million doses that we need. And we'd know where the people were who had the disease, but we didn't have the money to get the trucks and the airplanes to get us there. And that's pretty much where we are with global slavery. We know how to do it. We know how to deal with it. We know how much it will cost to do so. We know the right procedures and ways to get people out of slavery, but we don't have the resources yet to scale up to make that happen at a globally effective level. Now, we've also been watching in the last 3 or 4 years a rapid increase in the amount of money available that's being spent by governments, NGOs, investors, and so forth. So, you know, if the trend continues, we may be there in 10 years or 20 years, but we're not there yet. Give me a time check. I don't want to go long, though. Are we okay? What happened?
About 10 more minutes.
Oh, there he is, over there. Oh, sorry, it's your nap time. Forgot. Yeah.
About 10 more minutes.
Okay, yes.
Is there work being done, like you talked about how there's a lot of work being done to take the people out of slavery, but is there work being done sort of from like the top down to eliminate like the drivers for the people who are enslaving people? Because obviously something is creating like,
Yeah.
it takes a great deal.
Yeah. The question is work also being done that's addressing the drivers of slavery, things that create the situations which make people enslavable? And the answer is yes, absolutely. But again, it's often a question of scaling up. Some places it's about education, sometimes it's about rights, sometimes it's about women's rights. All of those things fit together, and there are a lot of great programs, some of which are not about ending slavery, but actually have the effect of ending slavery, if they're done well. All right, if we only got 10 minutes, a few people had to scoot out in a minute. I'm going to take another couple of questions, but let me just say, if you have to scoot out early, don't forget to go buy a book on your way out. And the key thing here is that there's a special offer today on the books. Sadly, it's not financial, but the special offer is this. If you buy the book today, I will not just sign the book. I will write inside the book anything you tell me to write. So anything at all, about anyone, to anyone, of any sort. Okay? So just, you don't want to miss that. Okay, now, sir.
Have you run into situations where criminals or local gangs are they're basically running the local economy, big town, and if it weren't for them, there wouldn't be much money flow because there isn't investment from the government?
That's a good question. Are there situations where there are criminal gangs running an economy to the point that in a sense, they are the business and the economy of the community because there's not necessarily money coming from government? Absolutely is the answer. And in fact, the first quarter of the book is set in Eastern Congo, where the whole world is not ruled by the government, but by armed rebel groups or armed gangs, basically. But what I would say to you is, while they run it and corruptly feed on it as parasites, the economy would be, without any government, if the government never came, the economy would be much better off without them. Because the resources are still there, and the workers are still there, and the normal ways of having a life are still there, except they've often been destroyed by the armed gang. So, you know, if you took away the armed gangs, who are the parasites, and let people continue to farm as they would like to, as opposed to being rounded up and forced to mine, or they would do a bit of mining plus the fishing, whatever, you know, it would be much better without them. If the government got involved and helped them to build schools or hospitals or whatever, it would be even better. Yeah. Somebody put their hand up over on this side. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of demonstration, how do you get access to libraries? I actually, I might get involved there.
Yeah. So how do I get access to some of these mines and quarries and places like that? So the answer is, sometimes you just don't, right? So let me be clear, you know, there's a lot of them, and a lot of times I've been to places and somebody's just like pointed a gun and said, you guys should leave, and you go, right? But there are also times where it's all about local people who are usually local anti-slavery workers or environmental workers, who know their way around, know what to do, and can figure out a way to slip you in there, sometimes lying through your teeth to the people who are there. I went to a lot of brick kilns in the past with a Pakistani colleague, but we would show up and say, we're journalists and we're writing a piece for The Economist about the brick industry, and we really feel like you brick kiln owners have not been in good press. So we want to hear the truth. Right? And a lot of them would point a gun at us and say, you should go. But some of them would say, let's have a cup of tea and we'll talk about it. And like that. So you know, subterfuge, sneaking around, all kinds of stuff. You just do what you can. One more question? Yes, sir.
With the recent climate change or the recent climate deal that was signed in Paris, which sets a cap on CO2 emissions
Yeah.
for countries in the world, do you think that will help give an incentive to governments to kind of go in and bring those slave operations for large quantities of CO2?
Well, I'm hoping so, because one of the things that was almost on the edge of being exciting about Paris, the Paris Treaty, is that they actually came to an agreement. A whole series of previous big treaty meetings like this ended with no agreement whatsoever. It's been a complete failure for about 15 years. So this time they finally actually said, we are going to make an agreement. Now, whether they keep that agreement is a big question. But this book was actually released and the news came out just after that treaty, after that agreement was made. What I'm hoping is that governments will say, oh, phew, right? We just promised, you know, to reduce our CO2 by this level. And here's a way we might be able to do that where it's actually not going to hurt the people who are our friendly friends, right, who run big industries. It'll be our other little quiet friends who are criminals, right? Or maybe we can get rid of some of the criminals. So I hope so. I'm hoping this will be picked up in that way. Yeah. Monty, do you need to say anything? Thank you, everybody.
Let's thank Dr. Bales.